all to take your seats, and we're going to begin our second panel. The second panel this morning is going to be on U.S. government policy goals and responses. My name is Kathleen Keenest, and I am at the U.S. Institute of Peace, which is a quasi-governmental institution founded and mandated by the U.S. Congress 30 years ago to focus on international peace building and conflict management. I lead their gender and peace building programs, so the issues that we have discussed this morning and that we will be focusing on in the next panel are not only everyday conversations in our work, but very close to my heart. I feel particularly honored to have been asked to be moderator of our really esteemed panel here this morning. I will very briefly introduce each panelist who have prepared about 5 minutes of remarks, and then we really do want to open the discussion up again as we did in the first panel. I think it's really critical for us to get our hands around what are your concerns, what are the issues at hand. I will say this panel has a tough job in front of them. The policy goals and responses to the problem of ISIS and its violence against women, girls, and children in general is a difficult one. And so I'm going to ask my colleague Stephanie Foster, who is advisor in the Secretary of State's Office of Global Women's Issues at our U.S. Department of State, to begin the conversation. Stephanie is no stranger to issues of women and girls. She has 25 years of experience in both domestic and international policy, and most recently has spent a year on the ground in Kabul, Afghanistan, addressing numerous issues that are related to gender concerns. Stephanie received a JD from the University of Pennsylvania, an MRP from Cornell University, and a BA from the University of California, which I think is important to know in a university setting where people are coming from. Stephanie, please set the scene. What is happening at the State Department, and what do we need to know today?
Great. And is this working? No. It is working. Don't touch it. Don't touch it. I want to start by thanking all of you for coming, obviously, and for having us. This is obviously a very topical issue, and I'm always impressed when people are willing to spend a lot of time and really delve into the details on issues that confront us every day. Before I talk specifically about the situation that we're here to talk about, I thought I'd set the stage a little bit and give you a sense of some of the mechanisms that we have at the State Department, and I think Susan will talk about the same at USAID, that really to sort of funnel in to the foreign policy mechanisms of our State Department, focusing on the issues of women and girls. So for those of you who don't know, there is a Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues where I work. The idea of that office has been around for quite a while and has been in existence for a while. Under Secretary Clinton, the office was elevated to a Secretary's Office and is now led by an ambassador. We have now the second ambassador at large for Global Women's Issues, Catherine Russell. The reason I mention that is I think it's very important to talk about the mechanism that we have. It's not the only one, obviously. People in the regional bureaus who are tasked with this issue, people in the functional bureaus, people in USAID and DOD, Department of Defense, all work on the issues that are relevant to them. But we do have a specialized office, and that is our job, is to really ensure that we are asking the questions every day, what's the impact on women and girls in any particular issue. And we work on a broad range of issues, women, peace, and security being only one of them. We work on other issues, all of which are actually related, I would say: economic empowerment, political participation, ending gender-based violence, and focusing on adolescent girls. But all of those issues are issues that are important to us, and we use the office and our ambassador's voice to really focus on these issues and try to raise them to the most appropriate level within U.S. foreign policy. So I would say that because I think that helps perhaps lay the groundwork for what I'm going to talk about in terms of what where the State Department is and what we have done to date with regard to this issue. I think also the last thing I'll say is I would encourage all of you that think of our office this summer that you certainly can be in touch with if you have more information on this issue or any issues that you feel you would like to try to have us funnel to the right places in the State Department and try to get to the right people. So let me start off with that and then say I want to talk really about three very basic things. One is our diplomatic engagement on this issue around ISIL or ISIS. And some of what we've done on diplomatic engagement. The second is some of the programming that is being done through various parts of the State Department. When I get to those, I promise I won't use all those letters we use because we sound like we speak a different language, and we do. And then thirdly, I'll talk a little bit about the role of our office and then turn it over to others. So with respect to diplomatic engagement, I know that sometimes people get frustrated when you say this, but we have, in the strongest possible terms, obviously condemned the actions by ISIL and ISIS in what they do. We have condemned them specific to what they've done with regard to women and children. Secretary Kerry's latest statement is very strong. It actually also, and I'm reminded by the last question, make it very clear that we do not believe that this represents Islam and that Islam does not condone this kind of action. So we take very, very strong statements at every level and ensure that we are continuing that drumbeat, whether it's through the Secretary's statements, through our spokesperson statements, through Ambassador Russell's statements. She's written fairly extensively about ISIL and its effect on women. And so we really try to do that, and we're obviously steadfast in our efforts to lead the coalition as we do in this area. So secondly, with regard to programming, our programming for the most part is small compared to at the State Department with respect to what USAID usually does. However, I will say in this situation, our Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration have provided a substantial amount of humanitarian assistance to meet urgent needs, about $180 million, which is, seems like a lot of money and is, but I'm sure there's a need for a lot more. And also, our Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor has provided funding to address some democracy and governance issues as well in the area. So we are doing programming, a lot based on gender-based violence issues, a lot trying to address the immediate needs of people on the ground and to really help build capacity, not only with regard to the women there, but to others, to men and to the entire community. So I think that's a really important thing to say. Lastly, on Friday, we announced funds, about $1.6 million, to use to gather evidence of atrocities. As we know, and many of us have worked in other arenas where gathering of evidence is critically important. For example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, when a lot of issues around sexual violence and conflict, one of the key things that is necessary to ensure that people can eventually be brought to trial and eventually be brought to justice is collecting evidence. And so that is something that is critically important, and the State Department announced a fund on Friday to do that in Iraq. So I think there are a multitude of efforts going on in programming, and we can obviously talk more about those as we move forward. In terms of the specific role of our office, I want to say a couple of things. We've been certainly part of all the interagency and departmental discussions on these issues, including, as we work towards various public statements. And I think that will continue. That's our job. We are very clear that that's our job, to really do advocacy within the department on those issues. So lastly, I will say one thing that I also think we all need to be mindful of, and my little ad, and then I will wrap up, is I did bring copies of something called the U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, which was mandated ago by executive order, and it talks about a government-wide response in all these types of conflicts. One thing we are very clear on in the National Action Plan is we need to listen to the voices of women on the ground. And so we hope that through conversations with the women who are affected by this, through all of you, that we'll be able to take that feedback back and put it back into the policy process. So with that, I will turn it over to the next speaker.
Thanks so much, Stephanie, for setting the scene here. I think it's really critical to recognize that there are these policy mechanisms and they are having impact. And I would add that in addition to the U.S. National Action Plan, there are over 45 national action plans represented around countries throughout the world, not only in the northern hemisphere, but also in the southern hemisphere. And many of those countries are countries that have gone through conflict or violence of some sort. Our next presenter is Susan Markham, who is the Senior Gender Advisor for the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. It's a little loud for you to use an acronym.
Thank you. That would take the whole 5
I
minutes.
told them, no acronyms. Susan is new to her position, and I say this because she was the Director of Women's Political Participation at the National Democratic Institute, NDI. She has been working on these issues for years, and she has both a civil society and now a U.S. government perspective. So I look forward to hearing from you. I do want you to know she has a BA from political science and international studies from Ohio State University, and her master's in public policy and women's studies from the George Washington University. Susan, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming, and I look forward to a lively discussion. I would just like to touch a little bit on what Stephanie mentioned about the structure that exists within the State Department to focus on gender equality and women's empowerment. And at USAID, under this administration, we have created a parallel structure within USAID. I am the second person in my position, but it was created in this administration to work on gender equality and women's empowerment, specifically across all of USAID's programs. Obviously, USAID has worked with women and to benefit women over the many years that USAID has existed. But more importantly, we're working to make sure that women and girls, men and boys are empowered by our programs. That global health, certainly over half of our beneficiaries over the years have been women, but how are we talking to them about their health issues in a way that helps them close gaps in access to services and resources that are provided? How do we prevent gender-based violence across communities and not exacerbate them through USAID programs? And how do we encourage and give skills to women and girls so that they have more decision-making over their own lives? So we created a gender equality and female empowerment policy about 3 years ago. And my position, my office, we work very hard across USAID to make sure that these theories, quite frankly, on how we make our programs better are implemented on the ground. And because, quite frankly, we think they make the programs better and more sustainable over the lifetime of the program. And working with the State Department, we have been part of the National Action the National Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, as well as the Gender-Based Violence Policy. And we have a suite of other policies, including counter-trafficking in persons, a policy to prevent and respond to child and early forced marriage, and all of these are working together in our programs. Specifically with regard to this, the U.S. government continues our response to the humanitarian needs in Syria, now in our 4th year there, and now more recently in Iraq. In fact, we were on our way to closing the USAID mission. We were down to 4 people in Iraq, and then in the last months, we've had to think about the resources that are going there and how we're going to be providing them. So we've done quite a turnaround, and we're trying to focus on the immediate needs in Iraq without taking our eye off the ball of the huge needs that continue in Syria. As you probably know, 10.8 million people are in need of assistance in Syria, 6.4 million of whom are displaced. There are more than also 3 million Syrian refugees in neighboring countries, and 80% of those are women and children. I actually just returned from Jordan, where I'm looking both at the work we're doing with the Jordanian government in order to continue to function with this whole flux of people coming in, but also the work we're doing on the humanitarian side with refugees that are coming into Jordan. And then in Iraq, an estimated 5.2 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance. 1.8 million are internally displaced, and nearly 176,000 Iraqi refugees are in other countries. So across all of these sectors, USAID is working. Protection of women and girls is a priority of USAID in all humanitarian settings, and certainly because of the focus in Syria and Iraq of the conflict-related violence, exploitation, and abuse of civilians, women and girls, men and boys, we are being especially vigilant in our approach to the support programs that we give. So whether we are working on health programs, food, shelter, we are taking and making sure that there are protection programs there to help girls and women and men and boys be safe about conflict, as well as meeting their basic needs. Specifically in Syria, we have helped more than 5 million people affected by the crisis, and specifically helping in health, food, emergency relief supply, protection, water and sanitation, and hygiene needs. So across a whole range of functioning in their daily lives, USAID is providing those, and we're working in all 14 governments across Syria, and as well as I said, the refugees in other countries. There are millions that are in need that is very difficult to get to, but we are working with, as we can, across lines of conflict and across borders with local civil society organizations to provide those services and resources as possible. Specifically in Iraq, as I said, which has geared up very quickly in the past months, up to 1.8 million innocent children, women, and men have been displaced. And so we're working very much on their health and safety. And right now, quite frankly, we are very focused on the winterization, making sure that they have the blankets, the shelter. I'm sure you've heard of they moved a lot of people into schools, and now that schools need to restart again, what is our long-term plan? This is not a short-term solution, and so it has been a short-term solution. So what is our long-term plan to make sure that not only the food and safety and shelter, but also making sure people are warm enough in the coming months? So I will go into more detail as we talk about the panel, but there's a brief overview.
Thank you very much, Susan, and we do want to hear more about it. And I know there are a lot of students here today, and I think they're interested in possible opportunities that they can do to make a difference, and we'd like to know more about that as well. I will encourage you all to read in depth the bios of our panelists. I'm only giving it a very blunt view, but each of these people are quite accomplished in their fields. Our next speaker is my colleague and friend, Ambassador Steve Steiner. He is a gender advisor in our Center for Gender and Peace Building at USIP. His own CV might take most of this panel's time, but I think what's critical to, and again, with the students in mind, this is a man who began as a Foreign Service officer and was in the focus of nuclear disarmament. And through a series of life changes, he has become the go-to person, the guy, the change agent guy, who speaks on behalf of women, peace, and security agenda, where he was also in the global women's issues. And Steve, help us set the scene and give us a longer view. We'll be back and what it means looking forward. We have representatives of the U.S. government who have been a U.S. government representative who are no longer, and so you can give us a back and forward view. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. And these are two terrific colleagues on my left as well with the government. And I'm really glad they're there because we do have multiple crises on our hands. To explain how I somehow got from nuclear arms negotiations to working on gender issues and women's rights. There's a common theme in both areas. When we were doing the negotiations to reduce U.S. and Soviet nuclear arms with effective verification, we truly thought we're helping to build a safer world, and I very strongly believe that empowering women builds a safer world. And so it's a good thing to be working on, especially now. And right now, we have a situation not only of the need to empower women, but to rescue women and to help rehabilitate them because they are, even if out and escaped, they're still possibly in great danger and they need a lot of help. So my thoughts for our government colleagues and for the whole community, there are 8 points that I would make. One is we do need a lot of priority to be given to the women who have escaped ISIS. And at the same time, we need new mapping of the women who are still being held. And there are figures I've heard from at state is something like 3,300 that we know of. This can be mapped, and we can do what we can to help to get them out, buy them out, whatever. USIP has redirected some priorities in this direction. We have one program on the ground in Iraq called the Alliance of Iraqi Minorities, and that alliance itself has decided to put its focus right now on helping women in these situations. So these are minorities helping women. Second point, we all have to look at the majority in Iraq as well. If a whole house is burning, and we're close to that, you've got to really have a bigger picture in mind as you try to help specific victims. Iraqi women are suffering not only because of terrorism that's going on, but also because of years of poor governance, sectarian party politics, which has been basically excluding women, and lack of social and political inclusion. So in all this work, in reference to Dina there, Dina Hurwitz, I agree, we can't overlook the human rights and democracy aspects of this work. We have to focus on them, or we're going to have another round of crises like this. We need far more from the Iraqi government, and we need to put pressure on them and help them. A good example, just one example, is documentation of these millions of IDPs, because a lot of them fled, had to flee for their lives, they don't have documents. Therefore, for now, they're excluded from Iraqi services and benefits. We've got to get them back into that and get the Iraqi government to do its job. And one reason they're not doing their job is, what a surprise, there's corruption in this field as well as other fields. Some of the money that should be going to these poor people is being stolen. Okay? The fourth point, we need to help both the Iraqi government and the KRG, Kurdish Regional Government up in the north. They both are in way over their heads. The crisis that we have here is way beyond their capacity and their technical skills. Fifth point, I think we need to put a lot of emphasis, maybe most emphasis right now, on saving and rehabilitating individual victims and rebuilding local communities as opposed to national level work in either Iraq or Syria, in my opinion. ISIS' strategy is to destroy not only people, but religions, groups, and communities. And they know, everyone knows women are the heart of communities, the main integrating factors in communities, thus they destroy the women. This is not the first time this has happened. Think about Bosnia and what happened there, what was done to the women. It wasn't just guys out having a good time. It was destruction of communities as a strategy. We have to help to rebuild these communities. And there is this shame factor. You know, the women who have been so victimized, if they're out, they now face other dangers, including the danger of honor killings and suicide. You know, there's a story of a Yazidi girl who was captured, and at first they took away all the cell phones of the girls they had. Then they gave back and they said, tell your parents what we're doing to you. Tell them what's happening. They're bragging about it, these guys. Okay? So we really, really have a lot of rehabilitation work to do to get these people to function again and to help others. And that's why some of them, in fact, the reading article said, bomb us. I hope they bomb the place where they're holding us. Okay? They don't want to come out in some ways. They're so afraid. Sixth point, we have to help the KRG. They're our best friends there. They have the best capacity, but they too are in over their heads. They've had no budget from Baghdad, I think, since about February. They really need help, and they need it now. They're the best hope for effective delivery and sustainability of the process. And if they can create access, they can give us security to help these people. And that will create some stability, which is ISIS's biggest enemy. 7th point, next to last. Howie is right that we need also to counter, and Muslim leaders need to counter, the ideology and the narrative of ISIS. These are not gender issues that are going on. These are major, major crimes against humanity itself. We need to expose the double game of ISIS. They say they're the protectors of proper Sunni women. They're not. Any Sunni woman who's opened her mouth has been executed by them already. They're singling them out. They're singling out women leaders. And these are also not religious warriors. I mean, they're criminals and have to be treated as such. And then the last point, and this is Kathleen's point, we have to get to the young people, and that means the boys too. We're losing a whole generation in both countries to war and to violence. They're going to be lost. They're going to be violent. They're going to be worse than lost if we don't get to them. Those schools have to be reopened. We've got to get all the kids, including the refugee kids, including undocumented kids, into schools and see about their education and see their future and make them a hope for the future, not a tragedy. That's it for now. Thank you.
Well, that was great. Thanks, Steve. And it reminds me of something I read by a Canadian human rights expert who said education needs to be delivered like a vaccine.
Yeah.
This moment of Ebola, like a vaccine, we need education and a space to reimagine a future for these societies. Our final panelist, Dr. Warner Anderson, is the former director of International Health Division in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense, Health Affairs. He is no stranger to war. He was deployed to Iraq in 2003 as a U.S. Army Special Forces mobilized reservist, where he worked on the public health team. He completed his residency in internal medicine at the University of New Mexico and served as its chief of emergency medicine at the Public Health Service's largest hospital. I don't know where to begin with all of your background yes, and he also told me during the break that he is a fellow anthropologist, which I'm thrilled to. So Dr. Anderson, please.
Thank you very much. That's the advantage of living to be older than 65 is that you have a longer and longer bio. One paragraph. As my wife Ruth will tell you over there in the corner, I was up at midnight last night writing my notes, and as I was writing my notes, I became angrier and angrier. And now I'm going to skip about half of my notes because of the discussion this morning, which I found very, very provocative, and I think it's a good launch point. I'd like to start first by saying that I don't represent DOD. I'm now a retiree from DOD who has 17 hens at home and 2 dogs and 1 parrot, so and a turtle and an iguana. So 150 acres in New Mexico. So, but I do come back for these events, and it's hard to believe once you've been as deep and involved as I have. I'd like to start with know thy enemy, and we've talked somewhat about a group called ISIS or the Islamic State, which I call Daesh. And the reason I call it Daesh is because it's a disrespectful term. And it's the term that most Arabs use in my acquaintance. And when we ask where the outrage is, let's look at the terminology that's being used. We call them the Islamic State. Come on, give me a break. What kind of legitimacy are we lending to them, and then we accuse the Arab world of not standing up to moral outrage? Let's use the term Daesh. So I'm going to use it with your permission. And the Daesh have a theological moral cover, as has been stated earlier, that they use to justify their treatment against women. And of course, under, let's say, old Sharia, there are different ways to treat different people, and there are the people of the book, and there are apostates, and there are non-believers, there are kafirs. And each of them can be treated a different way. And they are in Daesh literature. they are treated in different ways, and the prescription for how their women are to be treated is different. But if you look at what happens in practice, it's pretty much all the same. Let's rape them and you know, turn them through our own use. So although there's sanctimonious moral cover, the moral cover is quickly abandoned in the reality. But nobody here so far has touched on what I think is the real reason at the strategic level and the tactical level for this terrible abuse of women. And this is the amoral, not immoral. This is the amoral, without morality, purpose. And that is to sow confusion on the battlefield, to create propaganda, to perform ethnic cleansing, to place a logistical load on coalition and neighboring states like Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, Iraq certainly, and Kurdistan, if I can use the term Kurdistan separately from Iraq, sitting this close to State Department, and resource depletion, because all of these IDPs and refugees are wiping out the resources of these countries that are stepping in to help. And then, of course, it creates priority conflicts among the fighters who are opposing the Daesh, who are protecting their home and family. So when the Daesh approach if, for example, somebody from not to get too deeply into the weeds here, but if somebody from Sulaymaniyah, who's in the PUK, Peshmerga, is deployed to the lines near Mosul with the KDP defending Erbil, and Daesh does an end run or a flank movement around their lines and attacks Sulaymaniyah, then do we expect these PUK Peshmerga people to stay there and defend Erbil, or should they retreat back to Sulaymaniyah and take care of their own families? The KRG has 1,000 kilometers of front lines with Daesh, and they have 60 kilometers of contiguous space with greater Iraq. So think about that. 1,000, the KRG is defending themselves along 1,000 kilometers of lines against Daesh. And with this, let's say the mother country, the mothership, Iraq, Baghdad, where everything is coming through, they have only 60 kilometers. Only 60 kilometers. I was on the front lines 3 weeks ago, west of Erbil with Mosul, and I saw what the Peshmerga have. And I don't want to go into it here because Daesh has Google, and it could be an intel dump for them. But let's just say that these heroes are out there on their own in ways that most of us would find horrific. And they're defending their families and their homes and their region and their country. And in my mind, as I told them, they're defending the rest of civilization, Eastern civilization, Western civilization, both. I want to skip over, I had two parts I was going to talk about. I was going to talk about the responsibility to protect, which we can talk about later if you like. I was going to talk about the U.S. Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, which has already been mentioned, and DOD's responsibility area, which aren't particularly significant. And I'd like to move on to my fourth point, which is a rhetorical question for the President and for the coalition. Can airstrikes and advisors on the ground secure women from violence? That's a rhetorical question because the answer is manifest. Obviously they can't. The international community so far has left it to individual local ethnic communities and to political entities, local political entities, to defend their homes and families. So the Turkmen are developing militias, the Kurds have militias, the Shia have militias, the Yazidis are forming self-defense groups, and then move into Syria and it's multiplied by a factor of 10. So you have a situation where, because there's no coordinated international response, the local communities are all taking it upon themselves. Now I want to move into the next step from this. And the next step, I have a note to myself that this strategy is an empty vessel. It's like an empty pot that's sitting there. There's no content to it. I'd like to move to my next point. I have two more quick points to make. One is that we hear that we're out there to degrade and destroy Daesh. Degrade and destroy is kind of, I'm going to say, sort of an elitist way to look at it, but it's also an incomplete way to look at it. We have to have a long plan. And the long plan, we're not going to kill every member of Daesh out there. We're already talking about how do you repatriate them when we get over there and find out that they don't want to rape women. They don't want to kill children. They don't want to behead people because they're Jewish reporters. So they're going to want to come home. So how do we bring them home? This is the issue of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, DDR. This is a UN responsibility, but the U.S. can't dodge that responsibility. We need to start looking now at how we're going to do DDR. We have lots of people out there who are going to have PTSD. Okay? I'm 30% disabled for PTSD. I'm probably the only person on the panel who's killed a man in combat. It's not something you want to live with, but it's better than going home to your wife in a box. So we need to look at DDR. We need to look at how do you bring people back? How do you ratchet down the PTSD so that it's manageable? How do you take care of these issues? Not just in the men, but in the women. Not just in the women, but in the men. And the third thing that I'd like to say is that we talk about empowering women. You know, this will probably be an unpopular thing to say. And if I offend people, I apologize. But women do have power, and they have the power of the gun. They have the power of the gun. The woman, the commander in Kobani right now is a Kurdish woman named Colonel Mesa. She's running the show. She's fighting back. The PKK has units that are integrated men and women are commanding those units. And there are women out there who are captains right now in the PKK, and probably not so much so in the YPD, and a little bit less so in the Peshmerga. But the Peshmerga have already taken women casualties in combat. The PKK have already taken women casualties in combat. And the YPD have taken women casualties in combat. And, you know, every once in a while, you just got to pick up a gun and do the thing you got to do to protect yourself. So sorry for running over, but I'll be happy to take comments later.
Absolutely, and thank you for bringing Daesh, the term. I was moderating an event several weeks ago, and Lisa Monaco was speaking, and one of the Egyptian women stood up and said, what are we talking about counter-narrative? Why don't we counter by calling them by a different name, Daesh? Indeed, they are not Islamic and not a state. So we are limited in time because we took a between break. So I want to directly open the floor to all of you. I'm going to take 3 comments or questions at a time. If you keep them brief, we'll keep the action going. Please introduce yourself, your affiliation, and we'll begin right now with you.
Yes, Steve Hansen, Vice Provost for International Affairs at William & Mary. Thank you very much for another amazing panel. The whole day's been incredible. Since geopolitics has been raised at this panel, I thought maybe it's a good idea to talk specifically about the Turkey-Syria relationship. Turkey is not only important as a NATO member and as a country with obvious strategic borders to this whole issue, but also as a transit point for trafficked refugees, which is also an overwhelming thing. And yet, at the moment, the Erdogan government has made it very clear they don't want to really go after ISIS or Daesh without a commitment by the United States and NATO to go after Assad. And so I'm really wondering if we're talking now, as it was raised, about boots on the ground back in this region, which most Americans are not ready for psychologically. Is that something that can be done only in Iraq? Are we talking about a containment strategy in which Daesh is attacked in Iraq first and somehow expelled, and then somehow later the Syria issue is raised? But how does one do that while the battle right now is raging the way it is in Syria? So I was wondering what the panel's thoughts are, since this is people representing the U.S. government as well as people who've been familiar with the inside debate. Is this something that has to be put on the table in the response to violence against women and girls and men?
Thank you for putting Turkey on the table. I'm going to delay their responses just to get a few more questions out there and let them think about it. Yes, please, and would you find a microphone? Good.
My name is Madeline Colbert, and I'm a second-year student here. And I was just wondering, we talk a lot about getting to the young people, and I know that was your 8th point. And I just wanted to know what actually are the policy actions that can be taken to get to the young people, because earlier in the panel, last session, we talked about how ISIS or Daesh is very good at getting to the young people and how they're very effective in helping them to, if not take action, but to do nothing, which can be very detrimental. So I was just wondering what were the actual policy actions that we could take in order to do that.
Thanks very much, Madeline. Great question, and we'll come to it. And just if there's one person who hasn't asked a question yet, and then I'll come back to you. Anybody else? Okay, please, if you could take a microphone or come to the table here and ask your question, because I think we're recording.
My name is Daisy. I'm originally from Afghanistan, grew up there, and we're involved in the groups, organizations that are functioning inside of Afghanistan. Some of them are funded from the USAID, and they are doing very good. And also, I am sort of challenging myself to understand the contradiction between the ISIS and empowering women in certain regions. I'm always worried, and as we know, Daesh is a horrible thing. We don't want to confront that. My question to you is that when you're prioritizing your agendas or policies, when you go to Syria or Iraq, how would you empower women, or how would you have developments or agendas that can be helpful for the women? Because we know that development cannot be happened without security, and if we do not have security, how can you have your agendas implemented? As we are aware of Afghanistan and what we did in Afghanistan, and I hope the government's policies are not, or empowering women are not the same as they did in Afghanistan. That is the only concern I have, because when it comes to Afghanistan, we always think about the first step that they made. They said we want to go in Afghanistan in order to save women, and that is all around, and we are really aware of it. And I hope this will not be the same agenda. And if you are, so the second question is that how could you
Only have time for one, if you would.
Okay.
That was a great one.
Okay.
I really appreciate you expressing your concerns about policy. And I'm going to actually begin and challenge them to start with that question. And if you would mind, I'm now going to ask the panelists to keep your remarks very brief, because I know there are more questions. Please, okay, you want to begin?
Thank you, sure. I'll go back to Afghanistan. I had a conversation with the Minister of Public Health there. I was fortunate to have several conversations with him to fire with Dr. Amin Fatimah. And Afghanistan instituted a program of midwifery, teaching women to deliver babies in reasonably safe ways. In Afghanistan, in some areas, when a woman had a postpartum hemorrhage, the treatment was to tie her feet together and raise her by her feet to the ceiling so she was hanging upside down and wait for the bleeding to stop. And certainly, if you know that massaging the uterus and putting the baby on the breast to suckle stops postpartum hemorrhage, it makes life a lot easier for the woman who's bleeding. So training midwives and things like that. Now Dr. Fatimah pointed out that in order for a woman to make her rounds, as it were, she can't be out there driving herself around. So she has to have her husband or her brother or a senior male in her family do that. And they paid both the woman her salary and they paid the driver his salary. So now all of a sudden, maybe the most important man in the household, his salary depends on this woman having a job. Oh, well, now that we've got that straightened out, she can't really do her job unless she can read and write. So he was very enthusiastic that he was requiring these midwives to learn to read and write. So they were sitting, so that's first, second, and third order effects. What he's never brought up is what I believe is a fourth order effect, and I think that this is where the empowerment of women really comes. That when that young woman, maybe she's 18, 19 years old, a midwife, is sitting at home learning to read and write by the light of a lantern, her daughter is growing up in that household never questioning whether a woman should read and write. That's the empowerment of women.
Are you going to take that question, or can you address either the young people question of Madeline's or Steve's Turkey and Syria? Which one?
I'd like to add a sentence
Okay.
to what our colleague just said. I totally agree with all that on empowering women, and in all due deference, I think the international community, it's not perfect, but has done a pretty good job in helping to empower women in Afghanistan over the last 11 or 12 years. And that's why women leaders there are so concerned that in this transition and with the international pullback of forces, that they could be left alone and that their rights could be rolled back. They've made progress in health. As Dr. Anderson said, they've made progress in women's entrepreneurship being part of the economy, and that empowers whole families and the children, as he said. And they've made progress in the political sphere as well, and we don't want to see it roll back. And the international community has to listen to them and listen to communities. As I said before about Iraq and Syria, you've got to go into communities and see what they need and help to rebuild communities, not just the top down, but the bottom up as well. And on youth, I want to say that it's going to be a long, long process to reestablish a peaceful sense of masculinity in the countries that have been so affected by war. We're working with countries like those in the Balkans who went through the horrible wars and genocide in the 90s, and there's a lot to be done yet there, but there's progress being made. It's going to take ages, but for now I'd say get those schools open, get those kids in there, get the kids and the families documented, and make sure they get all the services and pay a lot of attention to them and watch their welfare, because they are the future, for good or for bad. I'll leave it there.
So I would like to echo a few points that have been made with regard to women and young people. The first being that women are not just victims or survivors in Iraq or Syria. They are actors. They are picking up guns. They are making decisions. Oftentimes, they are heads of households that they have never been before. And so we must acknowledge this. Both, they can help their militaries, they can help the intelligence community, they can help civil society make decisions about how resources are spent within governments, where we are certainly putting a lot of work into helping the Iraq government or in the Kurdish, making sure women are part of those political discussions as ministers, as parliamentarians. And so I think that's a very important point that we try to continue to make in all of USAID programming, being more thoughtful about the roles women play and not just the first pictures that we see. A lot of the work that we're doing, besides the basic services of giving food, water, shelter, is education. We are building more schools in Jordan than we can keep up with, just because of the influx of young people, not just people who are fleeing conflict, but also within Jordan, the population of people under 15 is growing. And so really trying to make sure that education is a key. But I also have to add economic security is very key. A few years ago, when there was a poll done of men across what we then call the Arab Spring countries, but a poll done on how likely men were to support a woman's right to have a job outside the home. And across countries, across education level, across religions, the number one link to how likely he was to support a woman outside the home was if he had a job. And I think both in the recruitment that is going on around the world of men and women to go fight in this conflict, if there's more economic opportunity for them at home, if there's more place where they are part of their society, part of their community, part of what's going on there, they're less likely to go. And so along with education, hand in hand, we have to look at economics. The revolution started because of jobs, and now we've gotten away and we haven't really fixed any of those underlying problems.
Well, I love being last here. Okay. I want to reiterate a couple things, and I'll come back to the topic at hand, but I will say, because I worked in Afghanistan for a year for the U.S. Embassy, working on women's programming there. I think tremendous need some optimism, I think, at what might be happening as this new administration has started its first term in office. So I think obviously there continue to be massive problems for women and girls, children, boys, and men in Afghanistan, but I do think there has been progress, and the statistics tend to bear that out. I know on a daily basis life can be difficult, but I think we see a forward movement, and hopefully that will continue. I'll echo again, I think, the education point is critical, not just at the primary school level, but at the secondary school level, primarily for, what we see in terms of what a year of secondary school will do around the world in terms of its ability to really ensure that girls, add more value in terms of their ability to get jobs, defer marriage, have smaller families. I think those kinds of things are very important in education. I think also being creative and thinking about how to provide education in a difficult environment is something that needs to be done, and we are trying to do that across the globe, not just in this region. But certainly, education is a particular problem in a conflict situation, but we do know that across the world, 62 million girls are not in school right now. So it's a problem we need to address. On the sort of geopolitical issue, I would just say I think this is obviously a complex environment, and people at much higher, much higher IQs than I am and much higher pay grades are dealing with it. But I appreciate you bringing up the point, and we'll take it back. So thank you.
I'll just pick up real quickly on the last. I just read yesterday a report on Turkey and the development crisis at the borders by a Georgetown fellow, Amanda Yesin, and I'd be happy to share that with you. I also want to challenge my fellow panelists here. It's good to build schools, but we know that what is taught at the schools is critical, and there doesn't need to be walls anymore. ISIS or Daesh has done this through social platforms. Social platforms for peace building can happen as quickly and powerfully as social platforms for violent extremism and amoral development, as our colleague mentioned. I have to ask our organizers if we have 5 more minutes in that okay. So then I'm going to go back to the audience, and I think you were up first, but let me just see who else, second, and 3 more. So, 1 more for 3. I tried. Okay, very good. Thank you. Introduce yourself.
Yes. My name is Samson, and I'm a doctoral student at the law school here at UVA. My question is about the action plan for women, peace, and security. And is there any work done to encourage countries in the Middle East to develop their own action plans? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please.
I have a comment. Paulina Rodnika, I am with the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative. I wanted to mention a very sort of concrete program that ABA is involved in, and it's in association with Vital Voices, International Organization for Migration, and Promundo. We are managing a global GBV response initiative which provides funding to victims of extreme forms of gender-based violence, and also individuals who are threatened with gender-based violence. And within the initiative, there is a separate sort of pot of funding dedicated to victims of violence of ISIS. I have put out some flyers and one-pagers about the initiative on the table. I have some more with me, and I would really appreciate if you could spread information about the availability of funding to victims. It's something that really can address sort of immediate needs of individuals who have been who have endured violence in Iraq.
Alina, thank you for mentioning that. It's a great effort and a great initiative. My colleague, Dr. Russell.
Thank you. I want to speak about education and how is important education for the women in the region. We see 2 generations in the IDP, especially the resistant camps. The Yazidi, especially Yazidi women, The old age, they are hopeless, they are crying, and they have no perspective. But the young generation, they want to challenge the situation, and they have power because of education. One example I can give you, we met two girls who are escaped from Daesh and coming back to Erbil. We met them. One of them, she is just have 6 or 7 years education, but she knows that there is anti-conception pills. So when they go to the one house of the Daesh, and one emir say, I take you and you are mine. So she managed to, and she said that I saw anti-conception pills in the drawer, so I took 3 pieces, just 3. And then I took another 3 just to have, not to have a baby, because she knows that she was raped and had a baby for the first time. And it's very good to take it, but what was fortunately good for her, because she takes, and the morning she takes also, she get bleeding. So this is scientific, this is a post-coital response to rape, but she knows that there is something to protect herself to not have a baby from them. So education is very, very important. And the last thing, what she said, I'm here, I have very, very bad days there, but I don't want to die, because I want to just to fight them against them and raise the voice for the other people who are left there, and to ask her, and she come to the parliament in Erbil and ask for help for other people. So we see that education do empower in the good way we can. And if you have let me to answer Dr. Suzanne's, my colleague, about action plan for women in the region. I am an organization. We have doing the action plan for national action plan for women in the peace, to participate in the peace programs for 1325. There is already, but they are not implanted because the situation is changing. We have many strategies, but it didn't go well because of the crisis coming after crisis. So there is no priority to do it. But the situation brings people to the action, women to action. So, thank you for my colleague to speak about Kobani's women, about the women who are fighting. They say that we are equal to the man in the situation in the war. But when we come to the peace, they are also the challenging actors in the peace. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Absolutely, women need to be at the peace table. I'm going to turn it to my panelists, and also if you would say any comments or wrap up comments, because then I think we will be at our... Steve, you take the first.
Yeah, I have one sort of wrap-up comment, because I really like what you said, and others have said too. I remember when Milan Revere, who was our first ambassador at large for global women's issues, went to Afghanistan for the first time, first meeting with a group of women, and one of the women came up to her and said, please do not treat us as victims. Please treat us as the leaders that we are. And that's what we've all tried to do, and I think it's very important. But I want to add one point to it. I think women have to work together. And in Afghanistan, I think they're doing a fairly good job of it now. In Iraq, I've seen lots of instances where they have not worked together, particularly the divide between religious women and secular women. I hope with these horrible crises where there are such overarching issues now, that women will start working together better to help to rebuild the country and their communities and for their own empowerment. And I would leave you with one comment. Madeleine Albright, this famous rabbi, said there ought to be a special place in hell for women who don't support other women. Thank you.
I just say a couple things, and as a wrap-up, sort of generally, just so people know, I did, by the way, leave copies of the U.S. National Action Plan and our implementation plan, Department of State implementation plan, out on the table, so please feel free to take them. There are groups around the world, the Institute for Inclusive Security and others, that help countries who are interested in civil society groups in countries that are interested in pressuring their governments to really write these national action plans. But we don't need plans. People take action without action plans, obviously, and crises are the kind of situations where that happens. But I do think, particularly for us as the U.S., it's a good exercise to really think about as a donor government, as a government that is has an outsized view in the world, right, or impact on the world, how we can advance this in our daily work in the State Department, USAID, and the Department of Defense. One other thing I would say is on the global GBV initiative. I mean, we get that word out through our embassies around the world. That's also a fund that's done in partnership with the Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau at the State Department. We have a Human Rights Defenders Fund as well through that same bureau, so it's the same kind of things, sort of emergency response funds that people should just know about and think about as you're working on these issues. And there are also a myriad of other, opportunities for people to think about, small funding that can come through various parts of the State Department. I guess my wrap-up is, for me, I think these issues are obviously critically important, not just in the situation we're talking about today, but globally. And the more I think that all of us work on these issues and really try to educate ourselves about the importance of how to address them in a holistic way, not just through diplomatic means, through humanitarian means, but through your involvement, as civil society people who are interested in the issue, really raising the issue, ensuring that we know the facts about what's going on, that we talk to other people about the importance of continuing to focus outside our borders on issues that oftentimes seem foreign, right? Because they're foreign to us as Americans. I think that's really important. So I would, thank all of you for doing this, but really encourage you to keep educating people about why it's in our national interest, our national security interest as Americans that we address these issues, because it is. So thank you.
I'll just add a quick point. I echo that so much. We have had a rough summer at USAID between the crises in Syria and Iraq and Ebola and the Central African Republic and the undocumented minors on the southern border. We had more crises than we've ever had. We have these groups called DARTs, which are the immediate response teams that are set up to face these. And we had more at one time at USAID than we have ever had. So I was depressed and angry and frustrated about what I could do sitting in my air-conditioned desk in Washington, D.C. And a person who thankfully works at USAID but had studied social work said, do what you can do every day. Clearly, I'm not qualified to go on the ground and fix any of these problems. But my position, what I could do, raise the issues with people who don't think about gender every day and talk to them about the gender aspects of all of these crises and raise my voice and write blogs and tweet and write papers, whatever I could do to make sure that this did not end. The discussion that's here, that's going on in select communities around the world. So that's what I try to take of it. And I thank very much the organizers for this too. This conversation is unfortunately going to be a long one. And so we all have that role that we need to play in what we can do every day.
Thanks, Susan. And Warren.
Thanks. Much of the action on the ground right now is action that's being executed. Actually, it's requirements that are being recognized, and action to address it is being executed by NGOs. And I think that it's extremely important to remember that while our governments, and I'm not singling out the U.S. government, but while our governments have this sort of apraxis is a condition where you have a stroke and you know you need to move your right hand, but you can't make your right hand move. Well, we have this sort of apraxis governmentally and internationally. The NGOs are out there doing something. The example that I gave in Afghanistan of women's empowerment that created primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary beneficial effects is very similar to the model that AMAR uses in southern Iraq, among the Marsh Arabs, and also in southern Lebanon and in somewhat inhospitable places. So there are lots of NGOs that are out there doing really good things. I have a lot of friends that are out there that I really respect. And if you want to do something like right now, this afternoon, I'd suggest that you find a good NGO to support, and AMAR would be a good one to start with. So,
I think just like that, everything we're saying here, yes, we have to help these governments, but the key people out there are civil society like Baroness Nicholson and AMAR, society in these countries. And there is pretty impressive, surprisingly impressive, considering the circumstances, the civil society that's already there in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, and other countries. So just think of civil society. And a lot of our efforts go toward helping them. By the way, I have a one-pager here on the work of our Gender Center at USIP. We'll make it available. Thank you.
Thank you all. Fabulous amount of information exchange and great questions and comments from our audience. I want to say again, we have a generational challenge here, and we need young people to help us think it through, because part of what is going on is a very young crisis. And if you think that it's up to the government or even up to civil society, I would challenge you. This is the future of your world, and we need your great ideas. I love the theme of this symposium, power of place, power of ideas. Put them to use. You've got them, and we need you all involved. I want to just now ask you if you would join me in thanking this panel, and then I'm going to turn it over to our colleague, Dina Hurwitz, who will talk about the next part of action. So thank you.
Thank you very much to all five of you. That was an excellent panel, and it really wrapped up to direct us to the next point, which is action, which is responses. So I just want to give everybody a few words of guidance here. We are going to get our lunch, which is box lunches in the corner, and you'll have a little bit of time to schmooze and check in with people, but we want to move fairly quickly into the breakout groups, which will only go till 2:30. So by 1:15, the breakout groups are intended to begin. You have at the back of your program a list of the breakout groups. And I know some of you, when you registered, signed up for a breakout group. We want to encourage, everybody should join one. If you didn't sign up, please join one. You'll find the rooms with easels identifying the particular topic. And I would like to take a minute to identify the conveners of the groups. So the U.S. government response, Dr. Anderson will be the convener. The livelihoods and economic empowerment, you want to raise your hand and stand up. Professor Joanna Schulhofer-Roll in the corner here. In this corner, Julie Arstegi from the Women's Action for New Directions, WAN, will be joining me to convene the legal responses. Professor Dillingham, Rebecca Dillingham, I think I saw her in the back, and Professor Bullock from the nursing school will be convening the health and psychosocial support. Neil Piper from the Presidential Precinct over here, Jane Kelly from communications, hey, in the back, and Chris Kiriakov, who's from AMAR U.S, will be convening the Getting the Message Out group. Bill Freilich, who I think stepped out, but he's still here. Okay, Bill's in the back. He's convening the last group on responses for accountability to refugees and IDPs. So the charge here is, of course, to take some time to discuss, ask questions in these groups, but then the conveners are asked to really facilitate the conversation towards some kind of concrete suggestions, recommendations for action, and that would be to any, either to NGOs, whether it be in the region or international, to intergovernmental organizations, to governments, to student activists, to health professionals, legal professionals. But we want to really encourage you to think very practically, very pragmatically. Who would you be targeting? What would you be asking these groups to do? What would be some steps towards implementing those recommendations, other than coming out with just some very general, aspirational recommendations? Let's have some really concrete plans of action that we can then further discuss. Each breakout session will need to have at least one rapporteur, and we have a couple of rapporteurs who've been designated or volunteered in advance, but we want to ask students to step into this role. So we have 3 student rapporteurs. Oh, I see they're not here. We need a rapporteur for the Livelihoods and Economic Empowerment Group. We need a rapporteur for the Getting the Message Out group, and we need a rapporteur for the Refugees group. So if you're interested in one of those 3 groups, maybe see me and I'll help connect you. So the role of the rapporteurs would be to, of course, take notes and then give the report back to the plenary at 2:30. And if you are intimidated by that role, then draft another student to do it. Okay? Thank you very much. I don't know, Stuart or Kristen, is there anything more that we need to say before we break up? Thank you for sitting this morning, and we look forward to being in small groups with you to discuss more.